I'm a small Kent-based publisher called September Publishing. So it's me and Alice. Matthew Green seemed to be living in a forest somewhere and hadn't checked his phone for months. And when I finally got hold of him, he said, "Oh, I'm sorry," which is just as well, because reading this today, I usually go speeding through a book to get the questions, but I couldn't speed through this, so I've only read 3/4. So I'm glad it's just tender maps we're talking about. Can you tell us about this amazing actual tender maps, the French phenomenon in the 17th century? I bet nobody here has heard of it.
So the most famous one, which was kind of the first tender map in a way, was created by Madeleine de Scudéry for her 1654 novel called Clélie. And the interesting thing about them is that, well, one, they're collaborative, so they're created by women in salons, so you can picture actually these women sitting together and thinking, actually, how are we going to create this world? But almost more fascinating for me is that they are not maps that are literally of the world. So as much as I love a sort of good map of Middle Earth or Narnia or something, that's not what they are. This map was actually to show the emotional journey of her female protagonist through the story of the novel. So it's a map of the land of tenderness, but this map is not kind of, and there is this sort of mountain range here where, you know, the orcs lurk. It's more actually, this is sort of, at the top there's unknown territory, there's a land area of forgetfulness, there's a sea of indemnity, there's all these amazing kind of areas. And it actually started this real trend for maps of tenderness to be created. But interestingly, when it became fashionable, there were kind of men in salons that started to create them, but they tended to be much more solo endeavours and often be islands and have like distinct borders, whereas the collaborative female ones were fascinating because they tended to just leave to the imagination what you can't see on the map. So there's not like a kind of hard border, you can see it drifting off and imagine, well, what would be beyond that is kind of up to your imagination. So there's lots of kind of creative space for the reader.
I can't help remembering that. I did a PhD on Anglo-Sikh relations in the 18th century, and we went to the Sikh Maharaja and said, "You crossed our border," and he said, "Well, what do you mean?" And we sort of showed him the map, and he thought, you know, often if you're in a third world country and you show people a map, you want to go to a certain place, they can't understand, they can't relate the map to this thing from Stanford's, and they didn't have the idea of a border, which led to a war and 2 Anglo-Sikh wars, annexation, just because they didn't have a concept of a border. It was a very tolerant kingdom.
Borders are fascinating in general, because I think kind of atmospherically where they are is not necessarily where they literally are, and then you have different kinds of borders where you kind of feel like you're crossing a threshold but you don't quite know why. Or counties fascinate me because I think they are atmospherically distinct and I can't figure it out at all. Like I can tell when I leave Wiltshire to Dorset or go from Somerset to Devon, and it's illogical, but different. I can feel it.
I wanted you to just talk, I mean you can read a bit if you want about that I thought that was such a good paragraph. I don't want to put it into words, about women and maps.
Where up to?
Do you want to just read as much as you want from Intimate? It's in the chapter about, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
It's horrible, I'm making an author read without warning.
No, so I've just
She's
described
just driven all the way from
bit.
Somerset, which she didn't know would be 4.5 hours.
Should have been 3, it was 4.5. M25, curse it. But okay, so I've just described a little bit what the map looks like.
And there's a picture of the map in the book.
Intimate. Female desire laid out for the literary world to see. A map of the unspoken, the undercurrent of the female point of view of love and relationships. We take our bodies with us. They are how we experience place. They are key to atmosphere, not dislocated from it. Intimacy is integral. It is our relationship with place. At this point in history, long before the 18th century with its romantic male writers and painters striding the hills, the 20th with the largely male situationist movement, and the 21st with its hipsters exploring urban ruins, voyeuristic, conquering. Psychogeography, emotion, was a uniquely female approach to place, a way that place could make visible the female experience.
Thank you. And your job is working with children a lot, and you draw maps for them, don't you? As doing outreach work for Salisbury Museum.
So I
love what you say about children's attitude to maps.
Yes, so I do. I often use map creating in kind of creative writing workshops with children as well. This sense of their place, it gives a sense of value to how they see place and how they experience places, and actually how you imaginatively interact with a place and creatively interact with a place can be full of extraordinary kind of worth and interest, which is very different to kind of literally I went here and I went there. But I also do projects. I did a project recently with a group of teenagers, and we took old local maps of their area and we layered them with their memories of certain things that happened to them. So you'd have like a historical map, but there'd be like, that's a lamppost on the street corner where I had my first kiss, or that's where I fell off my bike, or that's where my granny used to live. And so we started to build this map of this area of Salisbury that based on actually the memories of the teenagers and their families that lived there.
Because people do maps of love, of where they've been in love, haven't they? Or
Yeah.
cities as well.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about, basically the book is loads of wonderfully short, I must say, I love books with lots of short bits, descriptions of places you've been and what they mean, and you know, what New York is it, what can you see Venice fresh, for instance, because it's so hackneyed. And isn't it amazing how the tourists evaporate once you get away from the centre? Can you tell us about Maple? Because I found that an amazing bit at the beginning when you were a kid.
So yeah, so this was deep Devon. So even though I grew up in Somerset, we went all the way to Devon for a holiday. Very, very far away. And I remember this moment really, really distinctly. And weirdly, just after I'd written the book, I was rummaging through a drawer and I found an old pack of photos wedged at the back of it. And I took them out and they actually were of me on the Maple in that moment, which was quite weird. But I remember, you know, pre-health and safety days, we were allowed to pretty much roam as we want. So I spent quite a lot of time on a rowboat on my own on a lake on this holiday. So it was a little old cottage. And I just remember being in this, I must have been about 9, being in a rowing boat on the middle of, it was called the Maple, this sort of lake, I guess, rather than a very large pond. No, more of a lake. In this kind of very wooded kind of area of Devon, and just suddenly feeling place differently, or being aware that there was something very intense in how you could experience a place that we miss all the time when we just go through our lives. And suddenly, like, as I started to notice it, I could sort of hear things differently and see things differently, and actually, you know, if I paused and there was a dragonfly, and actually it almost became like an abstract kind of shape, and like could I almost hear like the hills almost like they were alive, and I could imagine them like kind of strange creatures. And suddenly this sort of intense way of experiencing place was completely transformational. I think imaginatively hugely affected me as a child, but it wasn't till I was older and I was travelling loads I kind of realised and sort of put the links together and thought, oh gosh, I've been kind of enthralled to this kind of feeling of like, what is atmosphere? Is it the personality of place? Is it like, how can we describe or kind of pin down something that is almost unpin downable? And then started to think about it almost like, actually, is it a kind of creative dialogue? Is it a collaboration with place? Like, and actually how something that we always see as background is actually very vital and alive and can be kind of quite transformational.
I think everyone here must have that sort of childhood place and childhood memory that they maybe haven't spoken about. You're almost superstitious about this DVD, aren't you? You only put it on when you're feeling down. Tell us what that is of.
Oh, Anna Green Gables.
But the 70s...
The 1980s Kevin Sullivan production of
And you don't watch the Netflix in case it...
No, I
so
don't.
why the Anna Green of Gables?
Well, I was quite obsessed with the book when I was younger.
You're not even a redhead.
Oh, I used to head in my hair in my teenage years, so I was for a while. But I mean, as a child, I loved her as a character because she was both kind of girly but adventurous, but clever and bookish, but kind of did silly things. So like, it was the first time I'd seen a really kind of rounded girl that could be all of these different things. But with
she was an orphan, wasn't she? So
was
many
an
children's
orphan.
authors have said to me that things, all the best kids' books only happen when the parents disappear.
Yes, it's a classic. And she's adopted by a family on Prince Edward Island, which is a tiny little island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada, in the Maritimes area of the east coast. And it just has this extraordinary atmosphere. But I think I was so obsessed with it when I was little that it kind of became a place in itself, the imaginative space of almost watching it. And so now I kind of save it because it's the one thing that the atmosphere is very hard to conjure. In fact, one of the intriguing things about it is you pretty much can't, as a general rule. But this is the one atmosphere that I can conjure as long as I don't overdo it. Like you don't want to play your favourite song a million times because then you don't like it so much. We've all done that. But so yeah, I kind of save it.
Because we use the word a lot as humans, atmosphere, but you point out in the book that it's not. It doesn't really exist in terms of science, does it? And yet it's so important to us.
Yes, so I did a bit of delving into kind of scientific explanations because I kind of wanted to be thorough, and I was like, well, I want to make sure that I'm not like just missing some like really important thing where someone's written a whole book and like this is the reason behind it. And even from like a starting point of kind of Googling kind of atmosphere, actually you just get endless entries about the kind of gaseous kind, you know, the atmosphere of planets. Like virtually, like you scroll through pages and pages and pages, and none of it was actually about atmosphere as in the feeling of a place. And then I started looking at kind of, I didn't really want to look at geology and things because I was like, that's too kind of obviously physical, and I'd be putting on kind of my human reading of kind of, well, certainly where I live there's lots of old long barrows and things not far off, and I'm like, that would be me putting too much onto it. And then I started looking into neuroscience, and it's like, well, it is perception. There's definitely perception involved, and I looked at kind of multisensory perception and different ways we perceive things, and reading these quite very interesting but quite weighty kind of neuroscience terms, but none of them really talked about atmosphere. I couldn't find anything really written about it much at all. Almost, I mean, maybe it's because you can't explain it necessarily, or maybe it is just that people do see it kind of as background noise, whereas my instinct was that it's kind of the opposite, really.
You read The Lost Domain, didn't you? The Antoine Saint-Exupéry, which we still sell regularly.
Oh, Alain Fournier.
Yeah, can you talk about how that linked in with the book and influenced you?
Yes, I first read Le Grand Monde when I was about 18 on holiday in France.
Can you summarise it for those who haven't?
Yeah, so it's an interesting, it's quite a short novel, written sort of early 20th century in France, and it's about, it sort of starts with just an ordinary kind of French village, and there's quite a charismatic older boy at the school called Maume, and one day he kind of borrows a pony and trap to go and fetch someone from the station and gets kind of lost on the way. And there's this strange shift in atmosphere, and suddenly there's this, he sort of accidentally gate crashes a party at this kind of faded chateau, and it's very strange. There's no adults about, thinking of what you said earlier, and everyone's in fancy dress, and the whole kind of feeling is like this extraordinary dream, and yet it's very much really happening. And then the next day comes and he has to get back home, and everyone sort of drifts away almost as if it didn't really happen. But then his life almost becomes this quest to kind of recapture that moment, and he kind of focuses on a young woman that was there that he sees as kind of the love of his life, and he's constantly trying to find her again. But actually, you know, eventually he does meet her, and that's not it. That doesn't solve the quest. It's almost like it's almost like an addictive drug, this atmosphere that he felt that evening. And so sort of his whole life becomes this kind of pursuit of a feeling, really, rooted in place.
As you say in the book, that tale of doomed love is of less relevance to you now.
Yeah, so when I was like 18, 19, I loved that doomed love kind of side of it. But as of now in my 40s, I was more interested in it kind of actually that how something completely intangible like a feeling could actually, that might have just been one moment in time, then led to something that influenced his entire life, and the pursuit of that. Even if he got what he thought he wanted, it wasn't actually what he wanted that moment again. And I think we all have those moments, certainly in our kind of adolescence, where we look back and there's a feeling that you don't recapture again. But then I think actually sometimes adolescence and childhood in their different ways almost become kind of atmospheres that we carry around inside ourselves. So everywhere that we experience as an adult, we will bring our own kind of atmosphere or childhood or adolescence with us that will influence how we experience that place, and it evolves and changes with time. It changes with different places, it will respond different days. Like, it's so fluid, this feeling of place, yet there's kind of core parts of our lives that I think we carry with us, and I think that's what Anne Fournier kind of captures so perfectly in the
Yeah. I think in a way this is a book about mindfulness as well, it seems to me, and how the past is always with us. Can you tell us about your past going to these dodgy gigs in caves and things? My daughter's 40, and I asked her how she found out that these raves were happening pre-internet.
Oh gosh, well, going to sort of strange parties and things.
Yeah.
They had flyers, it was old school. There'd be like paper flyers around, yeah. And you would like go to things based on that. But when I was
that
travelling,
underground
they were a bit
culture,
more,
to me, I was thinking of all these barrows as well in Somerset as I read what you were talking about, going to these.
well, there was gigs as well. I mean, I was a real kind of indie kid, but in the 90s, Indian dance kind of crossed over a lot, and Somerset, sort of everyone just sort of hangs out together. So it was a mixture of just kind of going to sort of small town gigs, like you probably have a venue in Canterbury that's been here that everyone's gone to for years now. There's one in Bath and Bristol. So it would be a mixture of like going to see little bands play in little gig venues to as you say, the more kind of strange kind of parties in fields. But the bigger parties and things, it was flyers. But when I was travelling, it was always more accidental, the kind of underground culture, and that was kind of exciting. It's that kind of randomly, trying to find the interesting bar in Belgrade, which someone says is through the abandoned shopping centre. There's no signpost, and you have to kind of just randomly sort of push at some old panels to see if it's there. Then you walk in, and it's like a beautiful little bar.
I wanted to, before we get us all talking about it, cities. You completely celebrate cities. New York and Venice, and you talk about Venice. I love the way you talk about Venice, that it's hard to see it fresh, but you managed to. I was surprised to see a chapter about Venice. I was like, oh, that's such a touristy place.
Well, I think it fascinates me, one, because its atmosphere was so different to what my preconceptions of it were. It's very, yes, it's watery, but it's a different kind of watery. It's kind of dark and strange and damp, and yet every now and again there's beautiful, beautiful light that, yes, we've seen in, the painters from there. But it was just, it felt very different. And as soon as you kind of got off the tourist track, which is surprisingly possible, it's kind of feels quite empty and strange, and like you're in it feels like a shape-shifting city to me. Like, you go around corners, it changes. You go back the next day and you try and walk your steps, and they do not work. Like, that road is gone. Like, that little path is gone, but like can't have gone rather. But it's not there anymore. And that cafe you found is definitely not there anymore. And then because I never had any money when I was younger as well, I would sort of get the kind of local kind of equivalent of a bus pass, and they can hop on and off boats, and sometimes I would just stay on them to see where they went. So they would go out to kind of one of the weird industrial areas or different islands, and that was really interesting. But I wanted to talk about cities in the book, and it's interesting because a lot of people, I'm quite rural, and there's a lot of kind of rural aspects in the book, but I do get asked a lot in the vein of kind of nature writing, and I was like, well, it does sort of fit. If you like a lot of nature writing, you might like the book, but actually it's really quite an urban book. So it's really interesting that you picked up on that.
I was thinking, you talk about New York, it reminds me of the beginning of Manhattan, if anybody remembers, when Woody Allen writes about New York, and he says, no, that's not the way to describe it. He's got these 5 different ways. He starts pretentious and simple while the Gershwin's playing it. And what did you think of New York compared to your preconceptions?
New York? Well, it's weird because the first time I went to New York was when I was about 18, and I weirdly had work experience on Sesame Street at the Children's Television Workshop.
On the actual TV program.
So I kind of was going to kind of work during the day, and then I was staying in a kind of youth hostel, and I had no money, and it was pre-internet, and I didn't know anyone, so I would sort of do what I kind of felt sort of safe as kind of a rural 18-year-old doing in New York by myself. So I would like go for long walks while it was still
And that was tough in the
light.
80s.
It was very, and I think what I learned quite quickly is how and it's actually the same in a lot of American cities. I remember my dad saying it about New Orleans. I remember finding it myself in Nashville and Memphis. Is you can walk like a couple of blocks and suddenly you're in a really dangerous neighborhood. Whereas I think it's a lot in European cities it doesn't quite work like that. So I kind of had to be kind of slightly kind of open to the those kind of atmosphere clues of like, this feels a little different, maybe I should turn around now. So I did a lot of walking, and I didn't really see, yes, there are the famous buildings, but I kind of got to know it at street level really, and I think we're used to New York by skyline, so it's quite interesting kind of actually at that kind of ground level, just walking. But I did like the energy, like, you know, and for a complete indie kid as I was, you know, it's sort of music record shops look excellent, you know.
Do you think the spirit of your book and what you're trying to say, which I've drawn out probably very, very badly, that you can talk about if you buy the book, Japan seems to really gel with a lot of what you're saying. Can you talk about how Japan influenced you?
So Japan was a really interesting place for me when I went there, because before I went, everyone had been kind of, oh, it's so busy, it's so chaotic, it's really stressful. And I found it incredibly calming, like, because everything kind of, I remember just wandering around Tokyo, and yes, it was very busy, but unless you would get on the kind of equivalent of the tube, and it was very busy, but like everything was bang on time to the second, and it just, and there was a weird mixture of like, I had these preconceptions of it being very futuristic, but a lot of Tokyo is incredibly old, and there's sort of wires above ground everywhere, like just trailing. I just remember the wires everywhere. But I also kind of, I decided to embrace getting lost, because I very naively, at the time, I hadn't really thought through not being able to read, which I know sounds incredibly stupid, but like, I just hadn't really thought about navigating signposts without being able to read. So I kind of realised pretty quickly that I was going to have to be very at peace with maybe not getting to the right place, but never mind. And so, and if I got little commuter trains out of Tokyo, the one place that was always written in Latin alphabet was Tokyo. So I knew I could always get back, and I worked out the metro system. So it's like I knew I could kind of get back to where I was staying with a friend. So I sort of embraced getting lost, although conversely I then actually one day got properly lost up a mountain, which is a very different and very stupid kind of lost.
There's a whole book on getting lost, Rebecca Solnit.
Yes, I know.
When I interviewed the great late wonderful Dervla Murphy in this shop, and someone else, we were asking her about getting lost, and she said, "Oh, I can't do the accent." Day 8, I'd consider myself lost. So she would wander and get completely, not know where she was going, but by the 8th day, she'd regard herself as lost, which I thought was an admirable attitude.
She got very lost in quite impressive, dangerous ways.
Quite a lot of places. And she's also a writer who's not, you talk about the sort of triumphalism of that in that passage you read, of a lot of male travellers. What did Edmund Hillary say when he came down from Everest? We knocked the bastard off, which is Chumulungma, the sacred mountain. And maybe there's a different sort of travel writing in which you're part.
Yes, I think, I mean, Dervla Murphy is an amazing kind of
women have changed travel writing, basically.
Yes, and it's interesting because still it's kind of not how travel writing is often seen, even though there's writers in the 19th century and the 18th century who are kind of travelling in this sort of different way that's very much not about, I think the difference is it sounds kind of cliched, but you can, and of course there are exceptions to this rule, but in general, I would say that female travel writers, it's a lot less about that kind of conquering of a place, or, you know, ticking a box, I've been there, or I did that, or it's not about putting yourself on a place so much as listening to a place or experiencing a place. So it's not necessarily a value judgment, it's just a different way of experiencing. And thinking back to the maps, it's interesting that the ones that are done collaboratively by women, they often didn't have the borders, as you say.
Yeah.
They give you that imaginative freedom for them to kind of grow and be experienced as you would, as opposed to, this is the place I have created and you can go there, or you know, need permission to do this or that.
We had an event in May once in the shop with Richard Maybe, and I handed out photocopied maps of Blean Woods to everybody, and when he'd finished talking about his book on the Nightingale, everyone went to the woods and he walked people through the woods, and
Oh wow.
2 or 3 people were in tears, I think, that night. So if you could take this lot of fine people somewhere tonight or tomorrow,
Where would I take them?
yeah,
Home or abroad?
anywhere.
Abroad, I would say Tbilisi,
I
because
don't know what country that is.
Georgia.
Sorry,
Georgia.
She's no one knows all about Georgian. We've got an event of Georgian poetry.
Do you? Okay, so I've spent many, many months of many years in Georgia. It's the country I probably know best other than the UK. And it's just a city I know inside out, but it's very atmospherically interesting and is kind of often overlooked, but also while changing at a quite astonishing pace in recent years. I first went in 2007, and last time I went back, you know, there were, you know, totally different, there was loads of renovations. So actually the chapter in the book about Tbilisi is perhaps maybe not one of the most atmospheric, because actually I use it to talk about kind of how can humans actually destroy an atmosphere, or is it kind of a living thing that's always there as a constant, or how on sort of renovation versus restoration versus destruction, you know. But as a city, I think just walking the old buildings with the crumbling balconies, are almost like strange pets clinging onto them, these beautiful like wooden carved glazed balconies. So I would like a little walking tour around the kind of back streets of Tbilisi. But if it was UK, I'd have to say I would take them to the forest near me, which is the ancient forest of Selwood, and still is, and was as famous and as big, and if not bigger, than Sherwood and all the others, but no one knows about it. And it's still on a map, is the apparently, and I say apparently because I've been told this, but I might be wrong, it's the longest strip of uninterrupted forest on any OS map in the UK. But no one has heard of it, but it's fascinating. It's like it's kind of near Starhead, and where they think that sort of Alfred came through. It's split up into all these different woods as well, and it was the site of the one kind of documented Sabbath during the times of the witch trials. It's just a fascinating place, but it's a shame actually Manny Green's not here for this one, because it's got an amazing lost village that is just kind of bumps in a field now, and it's just the most extraordinary place. And it's not a bluebell wood so much as a foxglove wood, which is magic. I've never seen anything like it. Come sort of late June, it's as thick with foxgloves as the best bluebell wood, which I've never seen anywhere else.
One of these thin places you talk about.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Thank you. And Cadbury Castles maybe near there.
It's not far.
Not far. I did some dowsing recently.
Yeah.
I should be quiet. I know there might be some questions of the traditional silence. Anybody got anything or share their own?
I'm interested in what you said about the difference between, clearly not all men, but in general, and men wanting to possess and conquer a landscape. And I agree with you, I don't think there's anything wrong in that. But this female, when you said we want to experience the place, to me, I understand that, I resonate with that profoundly, because do you think it's that we want to let space in? There's almost a sense where men want to possess a place, whereas we want to perhaps be possessed by that place.
I don't know if be possessed by, but I think let it in is a kind of, I like the softer let it in than the possessed, because I think it's more symbiotic than being possessed.
Yeah.
And I think for me, the one thing that sort of came up again and again about this idea of atmosphere and experience place is that it is a collaboration, it's almost a dialogue with place. And actually there's something very exciting and weird about the idea of maybe places aren't sentient in sort of hills saying hello, but actually you know, there is some kind of way of communicating, just like trees communicate through their roots or through, you know, fungal systems and things, that actually the way we experience place, if we open ourselves up to it and let that kind of feeling in and that symbiosis kind of be active and atmosphere really come to the fore as opposed to be background, then that is a very interesting way of experiencing. And I would say it doesn't have to be, and I think men could experience a place like that, absolutely. But I think in the sort of tropes of travel writing or place writing as a general rule, and it tends to be more binary. Although it's very interesting, sort of thinking of say how famous Nan Shepherd has sort of posthumously become recently with the sort of thinking of the living mountain, which I first read way back I went to Edinburgh, so we did Scottish literature, so I read Nan Shepherd like many years ago, but it's interesting because she's really into sort of, you know, she talks about the science, she's really interested in the flora and fauna, but it's very much like she doesn't try to possess those mountains, like they are her home. And so I think there is also elements of belonging in home, and is home a house, or can home be a landscape? What does home mean? So I thought a lot about kind of this idea of actually if we lose that idea that home has to be a house, which when thinking of childhood and adolescence, certainly in my case it very much is kind of a house, but let go of that and kind of open up and think of it kind of as a place, and actually then how we experience the world differently is interesting. And then it can get then quite kind of gently political, because actually if people did pay more attention to place, would we be in such a disastrous situation with the climate, for example?
But you know, the Maoris and shamans do feel
absolutely
the place speaks.
Absolutely.
You know, they do walkabout and male, lots of male
absolutely,
shamans
and that absolutely goes without saying. I didn't explore lots of other cultures and how they respond to place so much in the book, because I almost felt it wasn't kind of my story to tell, if that makes sense. And but clearly,
but it corroborates
absolutely, and thinking of, you know, travel writers and Bruce Chapman.
I've got to interrupt, as a bookseller, someone who your theory is corroborated by some women novelists, because I think women novelists who evoke place intensely are I Capture the Castle.
Oh, I love that film.
Lady, it's all about the house and the place.
Daisy Smith.
Du Maurier, come on.
Yeah.
The Brontes, Alice Oswald, that poem Dart. And I'm just trying to think of male novels that was much about a place or a house. And I'm sure there are, people can think of it, but
it's
maybe that
in
backs
a
up.
different way. I mean, there's quite a lot of male writers in the book. I talk about Helen Fifino or Hempomuk and Istanbul. That's very atmospheric.
What's that word in Istanbul?
Hüzn. Collective melancholic longing is the best I can do. Kind of an attempt to. It's an untranslatable word. I love untranslatable words. But hüzn, it's like
Saudade is the Portugal one.
What's
for
that mean?
Longing, it's sort of unidentifiable
But
melancholy.
they're often
longing.
about longing and emotions
untranslatable
connecting
words,
to place, and that I think is very interesting. Even ones that have like Hygge in Danish have been hugely commercialised.
Sorry, carry on. Because the Greek origin of nostalgia is longing for home as a word. Sorry, carry on.
No, you're absolutely right. So it is kind of that is really fascinating. But I think male novelists, I'm trying to think, because interestingly thinking about Anne of Green Gables, Ellen Montgomery went on a literary pilgrimage to the Trossachs in Scotland because she really liked Walter Scott, and it was like a complete letdown because it was kind of not, he didn't talk about the place in the way that she kind of, it just didn't coalesce in the right way for her in a very, which is kind of interesting. Sorry, that was a side
Anyone else?
note.
Sorry. Hogging there all. Yes.
Have you ever done something similar to me? I returned to a place that I thought was wonderful and deliberately took a tape recorder because I felt like the sound of the place actually recaptured it for me. And I did. Have you ever done something like that?
Wow.
I have. That's really interesting. I haven't done literally that. I almost used to do experiments in a slightly different way, in that I would see if I could, I would sometimes take specific kind of soundtracks for walks to see if it changed the atmosphere, and if listening to certain pieces of music, whether it was like old weird fairground music or like a band I like, changed how I felt in that place or not, almost as a test to see atmosphere is there or not. But I think sound is really important. I mean, atmosphere, I mean, it is very multi-sensory, and there's one bit in the book where I kind of almost consciously tried to go on a walk in as multi-sensory way as possible. But I found on that walk, actually, the sense I kept tuning into was touch, because it's the one that's always forgotten when walking. Because you think, oh, picking up a slimy thing or kind of a stick, but actually, because we're thinking of our hands. But then I started to think about, actually, you know, the skin is over our entire body. So actually sort of paying attention to kind of actually, you know, air on my arms or actually air going into my throat. It's the one kind of breathing, it's the one kind of sense that is both interoceptive as well as sort of outside our body. So I sort of experimented with, and that was a very heady, strange experience, that walk. But no, I like the sound of that. That sounds really good.
There's a new book by Caspar Henderson called Oraculous, which is a word he invented, which is about, each chapter is about sounds and soundscapes and how important they are. So just review. You had questions?
Yeah. I mean, the first question is: do you predominantly travel alone?
Good.
Yes, but often to places where I have friends.
Right.
So it's kind of the best of both worlds. So I have really good Georgian friends in Tbilisi. I've got really good Serbian friends in Belgrade. When after university many moons ago, I travelled wherever I could stay for free, basically, because I had no money. So I had friends in a weird selection place. I was in Ottawa, and then San Francisco, and then kind of Japan. So it was kind of, yes, I like travelling by myself, and I've rarely actually gone on a trip with someone. I think the only couple of times I can think of that is once when I was about 16, me and my friend, pre-EasyJet days, got a bus to Prague. I don't know what our parents thought about it. It's like no mobile phones, no internet. We just announced we were getting a bus to Prague, and they were like, fine. So I remember that. But that was very funny because we had literally no money and had no clue. You could do a kind of comedy sketch about that trip. But and then me and my ex-boyfriend went to Armenia and Georgia together. In 2007, but then I went back to Georgia again and again by myself. And there's something about travelling alone that I think is a little bit different, but it's always great if you know people there, because that just means that you get to discover the places that locals know, which are usually the best ones. It's yeah.
No, and my follow-up question was about what do some of your friends in the UK think about your travels when you say, like, I went to Japan and it was just quite, I like to get lost. Because when I've travelled alone and I've gone to places where I don't know anyone. And it struck me when I went to Mexico 5 years ago into Yucatan province, and describing some of the just adventures, not adventures, just travels. And like, you know, deciding I want to go to a place and not really worrying about how I'm going to get back, because I'll always get back. Because you always do.
Well, exactly. You kind of have to go with it.
But people, a friend of mine said, "You're so brave," and quite cool. And I don't see it as courage, because people will help you to get.
People in general are nice, I think, and you know, but there is an inherent risk in that, you know, you could have an unlucky moment and ask the one dodgy person. But I don't know. I mean, I think occasionally, well, certainly in my kind of 20s, a lot of my friends, when they were settling down, I was sort of disappearing off and doing random things. And I kind of had this kind of, you know, attitude that if I was invited somewhere to do something, I would go. So I went to Romania because someone said, do you want to come and do an art project? I was like, yes, I do. Right, I'm going to go. And I went, you know, so I think at the time it was possibly seen as a little bit eccentric, and sometimes kind of like, why weren't you scared? I think that does occasionally comes up. And then people have preconceptions of places. So both Tbilisi and Belgrade have travelled past many years ago that kind of people still associate with them. So, And I think often cities have, say, a reputation for being rough when they're really not compared to a lot of places in the UK that, you know, and but actually the one that some of my friends find the strangest is that I quite happily walk in a forest in the UK by myself during the day, whereas they would walk home late at night in a city, which I would feel a bit iffy about. But they're kind of, the thing that kind of scares them almost more is that sense of being in complete countryside by yourself. It's interesting.
Yeah.
There were so many questions that I'd love to talk to you about. I just think we should have a dinner party or something. It just feels to me like I haven't read it yet, but your book kind of crosses over into so many other areas and kind of fits a bit that's perhaps missing, you know. And while you were talking, I was thinking about whether you've ended up convinced that in 20, 30 years' time there will be a science of atmosphere, you know, whether when we've been somewhere we leave something of ourselves. I was thinking about Kate Moss and Carcassonne. And
I would
like
love to know the answer to that. I mean, who knows? I mean, possibly. Whether it would give us the answer we'd want, or whether it would be too dry and actually miss something, and if something that's so inherently creative can be kind of bottled in that way, I'm not sure. But I mean, yeah, it's I would like to know, and I had something in my head then which I've completely forgotten.
It'll come back if it's important.
It might come back.
The other bit is, are you aware of the slow ways movement, which is mapping journeys from city to city, town to town?
Yes.
There's an interactive map where if you've done a walk and you've had it verified, I don't know if people know about
okay.
it, that people are saying returning to our old habit of walking from place to place. And it's quite a nice feeling that there are people mapping the UK at the moment.
And you find different things, like, you know, you can't map a forest unless you're walking. You can't, you know, and that sense of distance and that sense of feeling of place, you need to be outside to feel that. So you could potentially get a very interesting different type of mapping. I've remembered what I was going to say in response to your earlier bit. I do talk very briefly. There is kind of a very old theory, sort of going back to kind of Charles Babbage and kind of who inspired sort of early computing. And I can't think of the date. Andy, you probably know the date. It was Charles Babbage. It's not on the top of my head. It's something you know. But he had this idea, and it's something I'm thinking about for my next book, that there's a library in the air, and that everything that is ever spoken is somehow physically contained in molecules. So this was hundreds of years ago. And his ideas then kind of eventually led to early computing, which is an area I'm not an expert on at all. But it's interesting because I used to work for the National Centre for Folk Arts. That idea of stories and air and folk tales and how site-specific folk tales are and how they change village to village. And then you have later theories. You have the stone tape theories. You have all that kind of. You have early kind of paranormal investigators of the 19th century trying to say that places hold things, spectral playback. I'm not sure I believe in that. I kind of feel that kind of has a sort of dark tourism edge, that kind of people always try and see the negative, whereas actually. I did a project in a prison, for example, a few years ago, an art project, and people were getting really freaked out. And actually, it had a lovely atmosphere, this beautiful old building, but it was kind of hidden behind the kind of preconceptions. But yes, there is some research to be done, which I am thinking about doing, about that kind of sense of traces. And is that kind of and you know, but he really did believe hundreds of years ago that it would be proven one day that everything that was ever spoken would be found contained in molecules in the air.
Wow.
Like a strange.
Do you believe in ghosts?
Do I believe in ghosts? I don't know is the answer to that. I have my auntie, who I would absolutely believe on the matter, is 100% convinced she saw one. I've never seen one. I do believe in strange feelings, but whether it's a ghost or not, I don't know. Is it more like a kind of living history? It could be an atmosphere.
Yeah.
Is if we see atmosphere as something that's vital and alive and fluid, as opposed to kind of dead background, then actually it could be a ghostly presence in some ways.
On the slow ways point, just before we get your question, Will Self told me that he got off the aeroplane at Heathrow once and thought, I'm not going to do all that taxi tube, and he walked from the runway to his home in Acton or something. Nearly got killed, run over. But I love that idea. You're just not always.
I can picture it with myself as well.
I read some stuff written about Tibet where people, and I only read this so I haven't verified it, but believed that the terrain was interacting with us. And so it went back to what you were saying earlier about Venice, and was that path there, and how did I find my way there, and that Tibetans actually have that belief about a relationship with the undulations and things like that.
Yeah. No, there is a different way of connecting with a place, and I don't necessarily mean it in a kind of well-being or kind of hippie or a more kind of hippie. I just think there is something that is more mainstream than that in many ways. Like, it's just clearly there, and people can access it, but we don't, because we just sort of go on with our lives, or we just presume that something is kind of.
But the most basic sort of WhatsApp headspace meditation tells you to go to a happy place.
Yeah.
Well, imaginative spaces, yeah.
I was just listening to you. I was wondering, do you think the recognition of atmosphere, or acceptance of atmosphere, or identification of atmosphere, it could be linked to abundance, either or lack of abundance, either in resources or power? I was thinking of the Edwardian Victorian novelists, female novelists, but also the traditional cultures.
That's very interesting. So you mean almost for there to be a really strong atmosphere, there has to be some kind of presence of power?
Or lack of risk.
Well, absence is an atmosphere.
Yeah.
So that's a really, I would say possibly. I think one of the lovely fluid things about atmosphere is we can make sense of it how it is for us, if that makes sense. And I think absence is an atmosphere. I think power has an atmosphere. I think certainly, there are places that have very strong, strange feelings, and there are other places where it's almost a surreal thing. Like I mean, I got teased about this, but there's a very brief chapter on Poundbury in Dorset, amongst all the adventuring around the world, which is now King Charles's kind of pet new town, and that I wrote about because the atmosphere is so weird, because it's like nothing is there, and it's like, and that's definitely an atmosphere of absence. It's one of the most intriguing atmospheres I've ever come across in a kind of new town in Dorset. But it's very, very strange. I think there's an sense of the uncanny with absence as well. Like, you feel there should be power here. Why aren't I feeling this? What's making this place feel strange? So I think there absolutely can be that dynamic in that. Whether it's absolutely that or not, I don't know. But.
Yes.
To what degree would you say atmosphere is influenced by one's own personal experiences?
I think that's a really interesting question, because it's the one thing we can't prove. And I think that's why scientifically you can't explain it, because we can talk loads about different kinds of perception and how we experience the world, and how the brain works to put together sort of random images to say that drawing of a cow is a cow because I've seen that before, and how we might combine kind of smells. Well, that triggers a memory, which triggers and then music, that would change something. So yes, we can say like it must be a sort of sensory experience, but everyone brings their lives to something and is going to react differently to it. So I think one of the fascinating things about atmosphere is it's not so much subjective, it's personal. So you could have one place that maybe it does have a core atmosphere, but 20 people will see its atmosphere as different, and whether or not there can be a core atmosphere or not is a really interesting question. But it's almost as unanswerable like, do we all see blue the same? Like, I get quite sad if I think that blue doesn't actually look like blue, because I love blue. But like, I can't prove that you see blue the same as I do. So, it's kind of unanswerable. But I think it goes without saying that we bring ourselves to place. But that's why our relationship with place, I think, should be that dialogue, should be a collaboration, because creatively that opens up so much. The idea of the world is there and that you can kind of interact it, and it can inspire. It's. It's interesting.
keep thinking of the beginning of Bridezilla Revisited, where he says yes, he'd been there before when he turns the corner and sees the house. Is there a last question? Oh, yes.
Well, I just wanted to version what you said, because I have been thinking about that as well. What I thought was interesting was when we were talking about certain places before, like Venice, there was recognition in the audience. So even though we can say it's subjective, sometimes we read something and actually it's spot on to what we were feeling as well. So there's a kind of objective reality to atmosphere. Which is
Yeah, and that's really, and actually how that ties with the untranslatable words is they're often collective kind of things. So like Huzn, which I talk about in the Istanbul chapter. I mean, and it's interesting, Orhan Pamuk talks about it in his autobiography, and like he has like these chapters about his life, and then when he comes to the chapter on Huzn, it's like one giant, strange kind of Lister's prose poem about all the different little kind of things that kind of add up to create Huzn, but very much that it is a collective thing that's part of the collective experience of coming from Istanbul. So I think there is something collaborative and collective as well as collaborative in some experiences of atmosphere, but how we each as individuals then experience it will be slightly different for everyone. But yeah, it's interesting. But then there's always places say that I love that someone else would hate, you know, and I think there is, or somewhere that, like deep in the forest, I don't feel scared, other people might feel terrified. So there's that aspect as well, which I think differs.
Sorry, could I just... So, I mean, so aren't we coming down to vibrations, you know, bad vibes, good vibes, and whether you personally resonate with that vibration? So there is, I do believe there is a collective core. I mean, you know, I had a similar response to Venice as you did, because I walked around at New Year's Eve at midnight once when it was completely empty in 1985. And I kept thinking I would meet into, you know, bump into some 16th century character around the corner. And in the same in Morocco, you know, I lived in Marrakesh for a while, and even people who were kind of hardened materialists that I met would say, wow, this city's got really mystical, interdimensional vibes about it.
I mean, maybe an interesting thing is kind of, it's become seen as almost slightly kind of hippie or alternative and talking about vibes and vibrations, but maybe actually, conversely, it's not so much that there are vibrations that you have to believe in vibrations or not believe in vibrations, but maybe atmosphere just is this very vital alive things that people are
quantum
picking
physics
up.
has proved vibrations are real.
So it's like
we
people are
do
picking
emit
up on it.
vibrations. It's not a hippie thing. It's not an esoteric thing, actually.
Now, why do people stop at the threshold of this bookshop and they take a in-breath? I see it so often, as if they're entering another world. So they go on about the smell, but sometimes they just stop and breathe as they enter.
Oh, bookshop smell.
It's because they're entering stories and we're all...
I mean, I personally don't feel we have to keep deferring to science to give us permission to feel.
Well, no, exactly.
Talk to any human being, they say, I feel at home here, I don't feel at home here.
Well, that's kind of what
Can you write a book, please?
I'm working on it, actually.
But I think that is an interesting thing, and kind of in some ways it's why I kind of set myself, you know, some people kind of like laughed when I said I was writing a book about atmosphere, because I kind of chose almost to write a book about something you can't write about. And that challenge is what that kind of interested me, that actually if we don't try to we don't try to contain it, if we don't try to explain it, what actually then how do we write about it, and what richness and different things can we get from that? And therefore if we approach travel writing or nature writing or place writing from the point of view of not trying to explain it but experience it, and what that might lead to. So there's some chapters which, like there's a chapter on the atmosphere of the South, which is almost like a strange long kind of weird prose poem. There's other chapters which might be quite academic, looking at kind of writers. There's chapters on kind of feelings. There's a big section on home and the feeling of home. So I think I purposely wanted to write a book that is quite eclectic and quite eccentric in some ways, but because I felt actually with something like atmosphere, it would be a horrible thing to kind of explain it away. Sorry everyone, like, this is a wonderful magical thing we can all feel, and now I'm going to tell you exactly how it works and spoil it. So I didn't want to do that. I kind of wanted to do something different. I wanted to see if I could, can can I try and conjure this atmosphere so that a reader feels it? But then what the reader feels, maybe I'll trigger some kind of emotional response, but it might be totally different to what I felt. But does that matter? Probably not.
No.
So there was sort of quite a lot of experimenting with that in the book. Yeah.
Is there a last question? Victoria, you look as if you might have a question.
I've got hundreds of questions.
This is our Georgian.
I was going to say Georgia. It's like I rarely meet other people that know lots about Georgia.
Just wonder how you chose the places that you visited.
Well, some of them, Georgia actually is quite is a slightly different example in that I saw a picture of Tbilisi when I was little, and I thought it looked like what my imaginary city would look like, and so I kind of, it was like an old weird kind of Soviet time postcard, and so I became, and I loved the sound, I loved the word Tbilisi, and then I discovered sometimes it was known as Tiflis, which is also very beautiful, and so like it almost started having these two versions, like Tbilisi, which was real but still had a beautiful word, and Tiflis, which was like this magical version in my head, and I became obsessed with everything. I became obsessed with the alphabet. And so I became a complete kind of obsessive geek before I went there. But that's quite kind of, other places it was more kind of like, I was invited there, okay, I'll go. Like I spent so much time in Serbia, but I originally went there in my mid-20s because I was selected for a British Council writing exchange with a Serbian poet. So, and we became really good friends, and so I went back, and then I used to do all these sort of interesting projects there, and so that was almost kind of a serendipitous accident, whereas Tbilisi, Georgia was kind of very much a conscious choice, and the South I got to know because my ex was from Nashville, so it's kind of like, you know, different, but then I'd always kind of read a lot of Southern literature, so I was kind of quite interested in the kind of the tropes of the swampy trees and things, always kind of interested me. So it was, I'd say, a mixture, but there are places I haven't been that I would like to, but yeah.
I suppose we're about to get you to sign some books, but it's a lovely informal event. I can tell you these ones are just fantastically magical compared to some massive author who's been on television. There's 200 people, and it's less interactive and often less interesting, and they've written a book because
it's lovely getting questions. It's really, it makes me think about it more in a good way.
I just want to thank you all for coming, because you never know with these crazy events. I just saw this book somewhere advertised. I thought, let's do that event. Purely selfishly, I need to meet this woman and get to know this book. So thank you very much for coming. You're going to sit here and sign some books, hopefully, which I've now decided is going to be £8 off, because I want to sell as many as possible. Don't tell head office. Pete's there, he won't tell head office. Thank you for coming. So yes, thank you. I'm just going to make Alice read these few lines.
Oh,
you chose this quote. I've never heard of this geezer.
So this is a bonkers in a really good way.
It's only about 8 lines. This is not death by post-it note, don't worry.
A psychologist who was incredibly famous in his time, and I discovered him because Elizabeth Gooch, who's a writer I adore.
J.K. Rowling's favourite.
Little White Horse was my favourite book when I was younger, but I love her work for adults as well. I think she's one of the most underrated and atmospheric, in a very gentle way, writers. And she, when I was reading about her, she was really interested in this psychologist, and then I managed to find I stumbled on a second-hand copy of this book, and it's a very strange, fascinating book.
If you don't mind reading a bit, I've
it's from Alan McGlashan's book, The Savage and Beautiful Country. Delight is a secret, and the secret is this: to grow quiet and listen, to stop thinking, stop moving, almost to stop breathing, to create an inner stillness in which, like mice in a deserted house, capacities and awareness too wayward and too fugitive for everyday use may delicately emerge. Oh, welcome them home, for these are the long-lost children of the human mind.
Thank you. Great.
You're welcome, thank you.
I'll move the table forward a bit. There's a pen here. Authors never have pens.
I do, but it's in my handbag, which is bad.
Yeah, that's
So it's half.
Great. Thank you.
That'll be a nicer pen. Mine's probably a scruffy museum biro that I filched from the
Pete's on till. You can do it either way you want. Either get one second or buy one first. Thank you, Annie, for filming this, which will be on YouTube.